The studio buzzed until the journalist smirked. "Mr. Freeman, isn't your career just a series of lucky breaks?" The audience froze. Morgan's eyes narrowed, his calm unshaken, but the tension was thick. No one knew what he'd say next. "Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Now let's dive in." The studio lights blazed like 1,000 suns, but the heat in the room had nothing to do with them. The journalist, a sharp-faced woman with a smirk that could cut glass, leaned forward. "Mr. Freeman," she began, her tone dripping with faux curiosity, "isn't your career just a series of lucky breaks?" The audience gasped. Cameras zoomed in. The air grew thick with tension. Morgan Freeman sat still, his hands resting gently on the armrests of his chair. His face, a map of wisdom and resilience, betrayed no anger. Only his eyes, deep dark pools of quiet intensity, narrowed ever so slightly. He tilted his head as if considering her words, but the room could feel the storm brewing beneath his calm. The journalist, emboldened by the silence, pressed on. "I mean, let's be honest," she said, her voice rising. "You've played the same wise old man in every movie. Isn't it time to admit you're just predictable?" A few nervous chuckles broke out, but they died quickly. The audience shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two. Morgan leaned forward, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the studio. "Luck," he began, pausing to let the word hang in the air, "is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." His gaze never left hers, and for the first time, her smirk faltered. The room held its breath. The journalist recovered quickly, her lips curling into a sneer. "Cute quote, Mr. Freeman," she shot back, "but let's not dodge the question. Are you just coasting on your reputation now?" Her words were a knife, sharp and deliberate, but Morgan didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a ripple of anticipation through the crowd. The tension was unbearable. The audience leaned forward, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. Morgan opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the journalist interrupted. "Well?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What do you have to say for yourself?" The room froze. No one knew what he'd say next. The journalist's voice echoed through the studio, sharp and unrelenting. "Well?" she repeated, her tone daring him to respond. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, their breaths held, their eyes locked on Morgan Freeman. The silence was deafening, but it only lasted a moment. Morgan leaned back in his chair, his movements deliberate, his calm unshaken. "You know," he began, his voice smooth as velvet but laced with steel, "it's interesting that you'd reduce a lifetime of work to mere luck." His words were measured, but they carried the weight of decades. The audience stirred, their murmurs a mix of awe and anticipation. The journalist's smirk returned, but it was weaker now, less sure. "Oh, come on, Mr. Freeman," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "You can't deny that you've had your fair share of good fortune. Not everyone gets to be you." Her words were meant to sting, but they fell flat against his quiet resolve. Morgan's eyes never left hers. "Fortune," he said, his voice rising slightly, "isn't what defines a person. It's what they do with it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I've worked hard for every role, every opportunity. Luck didn't write my scripts. Luck didn't show up on set at 4 a.m. Luck didn't teach me the value of humility." The room was silent, his words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. The journalist opened her mouth to retort, but Morgan wasn't done. "And as for predictability," he continued, his tone softening but no less powerful, "I'd rather be predictable in my integrity than unpredictable in my character." The audience erupted in applause, their cheers filling the studio. The journalist's face flushed, her confidence wavering, but she wasn't ready to back down. "Nice speech," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let's talk about your recent projects. Critics say they're underwhelming. Care to comment?" The room fell silent again, the tension thicker than ever. Morgan's gaze hardened, and the audience leaned forward. They could feel it, something was coming. The journalist's question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and threatening. "Underwhelming?" Morgan repeated, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, his gaze steady. "Let me ask you something," he began, his tone inviting yet firm. "What do you think makes a story worth telling?" The journalist blinked, caught off guard. I'm not here to answer questions," she stammered, her confidence cracking. The audience murmured, their eyes darting between the two. Morgan's calm was unnerving, his presence commanding. "Every story," Morgan continued as if she hadn't spoken, "has its critics. But the ones that matter, the ones that endure, are the ones that speak to the heart." His voice was a deep, resonant hum filling the room. "They're not about spectacle or shock value. They're about truth, about humanity." The audience nodded, their faces rapt. The journalist shifted in her seat, her smirk replaced by a frown. "That's all very poetic," she said, her voice tight, "but it doesn't answer the question. Are you saying your recent work is above criticism?" Her words were a challenge, but they lacked their earlier bite. Morgan smiled, a small, knowing curve of his lips. "Criticism," he said, "is easy. Creation is hard, and if my work has touched even one person, if it's made them think or feel or see the world differently, then it's done its job." The audience erupted in applause, their cheers a wave of support. The journalist's face flushed, her hands gripping the edge of her desk, but Morgan wasn't finished. "You see," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "art isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about being honest. And if that's underwhelming to some—" He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "Then perhaps they're looking for the wrong things." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The journalist opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked unsure, her bravado crumbling under the weight of his wisdom. The audience held their breath, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. What happened next stunned everyone. The silence in the studio was electric, every eye fixed on Morgan Freeman. The journalist sat frozen, her earlier bravado replaced by a flicker of doubt. Morgan leaned forward, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his tone inviting yet unyielding. The audience leaned in, their breaths held. "Years ago," Morgan began, "I met a young man backstage after a play. He was nervous, unsure of himself. He told me he wanted to be an actor, but he didn't think he had what it took." His voice was warm, almost nostalgic, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. "Do you know what I told him?" The journalist opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Morgan didn't wait for her answer. "I told him," he continued, "that talent is important, but it's nothing without perseverance, without humility, without the courage to fail and try again." His words were a quiet thunder, resonating through the room. The journalist shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. "What's your point?" she asked, her voice strained. The audience murmured, their eyes darting between the two. Morgan's calm was unnerving, his presence commanding. "My point," Morgan said, his gaze locking onto hers, "is that success isn't about luck or criticism. It's about heart. It's about showing up day after day, even when the world tells you to quit." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And if you can't see that, if you can't see the value in that, then maybe you're in the wrong business." The room erupted in applause, their cheers a wave of support. The journalist's face flushed, her confidence crumbling under the weight of his words. She opened her mouth to respond, but Morgan wasn't done. "You asked if my career is just a series of lucky breaks," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Let me ask you this. What have you done with your opportunities? Have you used them to lift others up, or just to tear them down?" The audience gasped, their eyes wide. The journalist's face went pale, her bravado shattered. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Morgan leaned back, his gaze steady, his message clear. The journalist sat frozen, her earlier smirk replaced by a look of stunned silence. But one question remained. The studio was silent, the weight of Morgan's words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The journalist sat frozen, her earlier bravado replaced by a look of quiet introspection. The audience watched, their breaths held, their hearts pounding. Morgan leaned forward, his voice soft but carrying the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. "Success," he began, his tone gentle but firm, "isn't about luck or accolades. It's about the lives you touch, the stories you tell, and the legacy you leave behind." His words were a quiet thunder, resonating through the room. The audience nodded, their faces rapt. The journalist looked down at her hands, her earlier smirk replaced by a look of quiet reflection. I didn't mean to," she began, her voice trembling. Morgan held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "It's not about apologies," he said, his voice warm but firm. "It's about understanding, about growth." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We all have moments where we lose sight of what's important. The key is to learn from them." The audience erupted in applause, their cheers a wave of support. The journalist looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, their eyes wide, their hearts full. Morgan smiled, a small knowing curve of his lips. "We're all works in progress," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "The key is to keep moving forward, to keep learning, to keep growing." The audience nodded, their faces rapt. The journalist took a deep breath, her earlier bravado replaced by a look of quiet determination. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger this time. I think I needed to hear that." Morgan nodded, his expression softening but still carrying the weight of his words. "We all need reminders sometimes," he said, his voice warm yet firm. "The world can make us forget what truly matters, but it's never too late to realign, to grow, to choose kindness over criticism." The journalist looked down for a moment, her hands clasped tightly. When she looked up, there was a glimmer of something new in her eyes. Humility, perhaps, or the beginnings of understanding. "I think I lost sight of that," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "Thank you for reminding me." The audience, sensing the shift, broke into another round of applause, this time softer, more reflective. Morgan smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that seemed to fill the room. "Growth," he said, "is the greatest success of all." As the interview wrapped up, the journalist extended her hand. Morgan shook it, his grip firm but kind. The tension that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by a sense of shared humanity. The audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous, their faces alight with admiration. Morgan stood, his presence as commanding as ever, and offered one final piece of wisdom. "Remember," he said, his voice resonating like a deep, steady drum, "the stories we tell, about others and ourselves, shape the world. Choose them wisely." With that, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a room forever changed. The journalist sat quietly for a moment, her earlier defiance replaced by a thoughtful silence. The audience, still buzzing with emotion, began to file out, carrying with them not just a story, but a lesson they would never forget.